justice on our rights. Hey, hey. Justice, peace. We made a joy. Justice, peace. To uncover the heart of a man, the way of this land. And justice for all was never the plan. Nah, it's never the plan. Justice beats for the two that part. Justice beats, last our smart. Justice beats for the two that part. Justice beats, last our smart.
All right, welcome in, everybody. Good morning. This is Justice Youth Talk Show, Season 3, Episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about juvenile justice in Indigenous communities. And personally, when I think about this topic, I actually don't know too much about this topic. So I'm very excited to listen and get some more information. But I just wanted to get a little temperature check from the group. What do we know about this topic? Do we want to talk about it a little bit?
Well, honestly, I do not know a whole lot about the topic, so I am very interested in what Ms. Metler has to say. We often are talking about our black and white disparities and what that looks like, and there is not a lot of conversation around the tribal, the indigenous people, and how they've been affected by the systems that we've instituted. So I'm really excited about this topic on today.
And just to add to that, Carla, I also do not know a lot, but what I did find is that there's information that talks about over incarceration of Indigenous people, which would seem to be consistent with minorities. So I'm definitely interested in getting more information on the topic. I think we will be able to definitely enlighten our audience today.
Agreed. I do not know much about the topic. That's why I've been very excited to learn about this particular topic. I think this is going to be a newfound information for a lot of people because we don't talk about this at all, at least not in my classes. And I think this is just important to know and vital to know.
I know Ms. Metler will leave us for information that we can continue to share with our networks because we need to bring all people groups into this conversation regarding juvenile justice. All right. Give it back to you, Jules.
Wonderful. So I'm actually going to send it over to Shazia, who's going to be the wonderful interviewer for today.
Well, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm just going to take the time to introduce Miss Metler formally. Miss Kim Metler, a Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation citizen, is the Next Generation's Director for the Association on American Indian Affairs, the longest-running national Native nonprofit since 1922. With over 25 years of advocacy, she has worked extensively in tribal law, intergovernmental relations, and cultural resource protection. Kim has served as a legal counsel for Native Nation, directed Tribal Stars ICWA training, and provided advocacy on domestic violence, reproductive justice, and environmental issues. A skilled coach and mediator, she holds a BA in social justice from Fairhaven College and a law degree in indigenous indigenous peoples law and policy from the University of Arizona. So here we have Miss Kim Metler.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks for
We're so
having me.
we're so excited to have you on the show today, and so excited to learn from you.
Hopefully I'll be helpful.
I'm sure you will. You have an extensive background, so I'm sure we'll learn a lot from you today. So just to start, could you tell us about your involvement with the Association on American Indian Affairs and your role within the organization?
Sure. So I so first of all, the association is, as you said, it's the oldest native organization in the country. And so they've been around doing a lot of really important work in Native country and on behalf of Native country. And I actually did a project. It was, I think, 2022 or 2023. I actually was a contractor for the association, and I did some work for them on youth justice reform. They got a grant from the Annie Casey Foundation, and so I wrote a couple articles and I did a PSA video, put together a webinar. Um, and then later they had this opportunity come up, and so here I am. I am the Next Generations director, and we kind of joke at work that I'm Aunt Kim, like I'm National Auntie Kim, because my programs really kind of focus on family and kinship of young people. So under the Next Generations program, we have Native Youth Justice. We have the Indian Child Welfare Act and the work around protecting it and promoting it. We are doing work on adoptions, what is a safe adoption, and sort of educating people about some exploitive practices around the private adoption industry. We have an initiative called Intergenerational Healing, which is intended to pass along intergenerational healing. You know, we always talk about how we pass along intergenerational trauma. Well, we're going to flip the switch on this, and we're going to talk about that we do this other thing too. And then the newest initiative we have that's still in development is partnering with folks across Native country to uplift the voices of Natives with disabilities.
Oh, that's wonderful. What inspired you to focus on youth justice reform, particularly for Native youth?
It kind of just happened. Honestly, I was thinking about this question when after I stopped being a lawyer. I worked in child welfare. I consider myself to be social worker adjacent. Because I'm not a social worker, but I spent some time training court-appointed special advocates to work with children in the system. And I always found myself walking around going, hey, we're not talking about Native youth and Native families. And then from there, I joined the San Diego State University, and they had a program called Tribal Star, which wrote statewide curriculum to train social workers on the Indian Child Welfare Act. So I was involved in that way. And what is true, and it may be true for other populations as well, but a lot of our young people aren't just in the child welfare system, they are also in the justice system. And so the natural bridge actually is the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it was like, well, you know, who's advocate? We have this law that we have to follow. to serve young people in child welfare, but what about those youth that are caught up in the system? How are we doing that? So when this opportunity came up with the association, I was like, well, I don't actually have a lot of expertise in youth justice. But this is an area that I think we could bring some really good advocacy and education around. So that's kind of how I got into it.
That's really interesting. If you don't mind me asking, what is the Indian Child Welfare Act? What is that?
So the Indian Child Welfare Act is a federal statute. And basically what it does is it sets minimum standards. So if you have to remove a Native child from their family, there was a time prior to its enactment that I'll just say it, basically our kids were just stolen by child welfare systems.
Oh, wow.
And so what the act does is it says, if there is a child at risk, you can't just go take them. There are things you have to do first. And then if you have to still remove them, there are still things you have to do to ensure that efforts are made to return that child safely to their family. You can't just remove them, keep them, and send them to a new family. So it's really, ICWA is a very important law protecting Native youth and our families, but it's also a human rights law because it doesn't just protect young people and families, it also protects our Native nations. And it does apply to young people in justice systems under certain circumstances if they commit status crimes, which are crimes that are only criminal because of their age. So like underage drinking, for example. So it's recently there was a big Supreme Court case, and thankfully the Supreme Court affirmed the Indian Child Welfare Act as being the gold standard for child welfare practice. And the association, actually, part of our work in justice reform is to advocate that it also is best practice for our youth that are justice impacted.
Oh, wow. That's the more you know. I never knew that they were just taking children out of homes. I've always been aware of the practice of them removing the children if they're at risk and working with the family, trying to see how to get the child back in the home. So that's
If I
interesting
can
to know.
interject real quickly to that too, what you shared, Ms. Metler, is very consistent with the Aboriginal people from Australia in terms of the just going to take the children and not giving a lot of thought to it and the kind of decisions that were made. And when you don't have laws and guidelines in place, that's the kind of things that we will see happen. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That is a very strong connection that many people will be familiar with the Aboriginal people of Australia.
Yeah, well, and I want to add too that the same thing in Canada. So anywhere where you have a population of Native people, you could probably look at their child welfare statistics and see some kind of history of unwarranted removal of those children, and also currently disproportionate representation in the system. Yeah, and I just had a thought. What was I just going to say too about that? I forgot. Sorry.
When it comes back, just jump in.
I will.
And I was just going to ask, could you share a defining moment in your work that reinforced the need for justice reform in Native communities?
They're all defining moments in a way. I don't know that it was about justice reform specifically to Native youth so much as it was justice reform generally. But when I was supervising court-appointed special advocates, the very first case that I had was this devastating and heartbreaking case of a teenage boy And that was years ago, and yet I still have his picture hanging up here in my office. But he went through, he was separated from his family. He ended up being adopted by somebody, and he was being abused by his adoptive father. And so he was acting out, running away, getting into all kinds of trouble. And as a result of that, then he became part of the system. And I just always remember that it just always seemed so patently unfair that nobody was listening to this young boy. Because he was 13, 14, but he really was just a boy. And it was like, nobody's listening to him. And those of us who are listening, we have limits to what we're able to do. And thinking about the way he was treated when he got caught up in youth justice, it was just like, this isn't right. You can't, I don't understand how we look at young people who have a background of trauma, like Native youth, this historical trauma, who are subject daily to structural racism and oppression. And we look at them and say, oh, their behavior, they're criminals. They're broken kids. They're bad kids. I don't know how we do that with a good conscience, instead of looking and saying, wow, what happened to this person? And how do we address the behavior? But also, if we're to be good relatives, how do we address the cause of the behavior? That's the healing piece. That's the piece to make it stop.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that like it's not just in particular to like just youth, when it's just individuals overall, because we never look at the backstory when we're looking at labeling these people and sentencing them for crimes. We just look at what they've done and never will it up to the moment. So I feel
Well,
like that's important.
and I want to say, when we're talking about youth justice, the two most overrepresented populations are Black youth and Native youth. And it's just, I don't know how you can talk about justice reform without talking about historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. And also, I don't think a lot of people are really clear about the origins of the justice system and what it was intended for. I don't know if my view that I'm about to say is going to reflect the association, but I'm going to say it anyway. But like, the justice system was never intended for white folks, right? And so baked into the system is inequity. And baked into the system is that bias and that racism. And I think we have to be clear to understand that, because if we're going to reform justice systems, we have to go back to that. We have to understand, where it came from and what it was intended to do. So if we look at the disproportionate representation of Native and Black youth in the system, that's exactly the result that was intended initially, right? But if we're saying, hey, there's too many kids and they're over policed, they're getting much harsher sentences than they should be, and these kids aren't bad kids, they need resources, they need support. If we're gonna focus on that, then we have to look elsewhere and look at the causes, what's driving the behaviors. And it's so much more than just putting that burden on the young people, but we also have to look across all systems as well.
Miss
I
Medler, it's
definitely
really,
agree.
oh, I'm so
No, you can
sorry.
go.
Miss Medler, it's really great that you address the inequities and the bias and the original intent of the system, because oftentimes it is hard to help people understand how you start in one place and you end up somewhere else. Like, people need to understand the full context and the intent. And again, I appreciate your transparency in saying it was not intended for white youth. It was not intended for white people. And so that helps us better understand how we get some of the outcomes we've gotten today and why the focus needs to shift. So thank you so much for just tapping on that, because that's important for people to know. We often hear about unintended consequences, but some of these consequences were intended because of the intent of the system. So thank you so much for touching on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, and I want to add too, specific to Native people, the United States, since its inception, I mean, when we talk about our young people, when we talk about families and child welfare, that is the direct result of United States policy towards Native nations. The policies have always been assimilative and genocidal. The intent was always to get rid of us. And the problem is they didn't count on us to be who we are, which is tenacious and resilient as hell, right? Pardon my French, but it's like they didn't count on that part, that we are made of those things that our ancestors gave us, right? And
Absolutely.
the thing is that as there's been this evolution in different systems, I think about this all the time, like the court systems and the entire body of law that applies to Native nations. That system was created and it didn't have anything to do with us. We had our own justice systems. We had our own process for dealing with trouble and problems in our community. And so it's kind of like if I went down to Mexico and created a court system and said, okay, all y'all in this neighborhood, you broke the law. You broke the law that I wrote by driving your car down the wrong side of the street. And now I'm going to fine you. And if you do it again, I'm going to arrest you. It's like, that doesn't have anything to do with them, right? So that's part of how we got here. And I just want to share a couple statistics to help understand how policy is created where we're at. Native youth are potentially subjected to 3 different criminal jurisdictions at any time. Most people is 1, right? And so because of the policy, because Native nations have their own authority over certain crimes, if it's committed by Native, states have jurisdiction over certain crimes, and then the federal government does. Our young people can be tried by 3 different systems. They can be incarcerated in 3 different systems. One of the statistics that I read was that Native youth are almost 2 times more likely to be referred to a state court for status offenses. And remember, those are those things that they're only a crime because of the age of that young person, like underage drinking. In 2021, Native youth were 4 times more likely to be detained in juvenile facilities than white kids, white youth. Native girls have the highest incarceration rate among all girls at over 4 times the rate of their white relatives. And I'm going to give you a statistic here, and I'm just going to offer the caveat that I did not have the opportunity to verify this statistic, but I want to share it anyway because it sounds about right, and it's also completely bananas. But 79% of youth that are incarcerated in Bureau of Prisons are Native.
Wow, that is high. Tremendously high.
So so that's like when we're talking about youth in systems and that overrepresentation, it's pretty serious. And then so that folks can really understand the impact on our Native nations, almost a quarter of our population within Native nations are comprised of young people aged 24 and younger. So when we have these numbers of our young people getting taken from the communities and becoming justice involved, that has a significant impact on our nation. And so that's why this is something that's really critical to address.
Those those statistics are really heartbreaking, and I really appreciated and it wasn't new information, but it was a reminder that this land that we live on is stolen and there were already laws and ways of living in place. So it was like a reminder and a moment for reflection, like, yeah, they did just come over here and implement more laws for for natives to follow and just trash their whole way of living. So that was definitely a moment for reflection, like to really ponder on.
Absolutely.
Um, can you give us some information on the advocacy of the Indian Country Youth Justice Community of Practice and its mission?
Yeah, so our youth justice community of practice came out of some grant work that we did. Shout out, by the way, to Annie E. Casey Foundation for their support. But one of the things that, and this predates me, I wasn't a part of this. I get to continue the work though, which is awesome. But they created a community of practice, which it's intended to be a network of justice professionals, bringing them together to identify what are some of the things in Native country that are working for our young people. What are some of the challenges, and basically just connect people to each other. And it's not just limited to who you think would typically be a justice worker. So, like, the cops and the court, it's not just limited to them. It's probation, it's social services, all the various social services that we might have. It could include education people. It can include, like, we have drug courts in Native country. We have healing to wellness courts. It could be elders that, they volunteer their time to support young people in the system. So we meet every other month for about an hour and a half. And we don't do so much talking about challenges so much as it seems that folks like to hear what other people are doing. So I try to round up guest speakers from across Native country to come and talk about their programs. And one thing I really want to do, because for us, this is a really important part of justice reform, is I really want to have people come and talk about collaborating across jurisdictions. Because one of the issues that creates these disparities is that nobody's asking these young people if they're Native, and nobody's contacting their Native nation to get them to get involved. Whoever's watching this, we're recruiting folks for our community of practice. It's limited to folks who work for Native Nations programs. So if there's anybody listening who's curious and interested, they are free to contact me at the association. But yeah, that's our community of practice.
Well, I really do appreciate the community of practice and how you guys don't so much focus on the challenges, but on ways to fix those challenges and collaborate with other nations to implement change within the community. And also that it's just not focused on what people would consider justice, because within this internship and even with our university, we learned that community is so much more than just the system, and it involves the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
But we're about to take a brief break, and then we'll jump right back into the Indian Country Youth Justice Program. Yeah, practice.
Introducing Next Generation Media Internship Program, designed for undergraduates, postgraduates, unemployed, dislocated workers, and WIOA participants. Our program offers remote virtual work experiences, qualifying as approved individualized career services. Learn while leading at your own pace, with part-time or full-time hours per week. Benefit from weekly debriefings and group supervision, along with our 15-minute masterclasses. Our projects include the Justice Beat Talk Show and the Just Us Youth Talk Show.
All right, and we're back. I wanted to ask, what ideas have emerged from the Indian country youth justice community of practice to improve youth advocacy?
Really, it's something that we kind of all knew, which is it's community-based and culture-based. There are a lot of programs across Native country that connect young people who've gotten into trouble with learning their culture and reconnecting with their culture. And those seem to be fairly effective. And part of that is because, with historical trauma, one thing that was in an intended result was a disconnect from our communities and our way of life and our culture. And so by connecting those young people, it gives them a sense of identity, a sense of connection, and a sense of belonging. And that's why those community programs work. And also, if you've in Native communities, it's kind of like everybody's your relative for real. We say we're all related, and we actually are all related, but there's also our one of our cultural values that's pretty universal across nations is that we're all relatives. And as an adult, I have a responsibility to the young people in the community. And so when we connect young people to cultural programs, cultural activities, we give them roles, we give them responsibilities. It's kind of like all of the adults are sort of gathering around and pulling that young person into the circle and letting them know they matter to us. And that can be very healing.
Would you say, because I was going to ask, what are some culturally appropriate alternatives to detention that has been successful for Native youth? Would you say this community belonging would be one of those things that has been successful for the youth?
Yes. Yes. And there's one thing I want to share that makes the conversation interesting when we talk about this topic is there are 574 federally recognized Native nations in the United States and another 400 bands or communities that have not been recognized by the federal government. So if that's a significant number of Native nations. And there's many that they're sort of related to each other by either by their language or through like a cultural grouping. But I invite you to think about it as with as many Native nations as there's a distinct culture, right? So what might work for young people in my nation may not be the thing that's successful for another nation. But despite having all of those unique cultures, there are some cultural values that are somewhat universal. And one of those is learn the culture. We talk about how culture is medicine all the time. And it's anywhere from traditional ceremonies, traditional songs, learning the language, to traditional practices that bring us back in connection with our lands, and with the creation that's around us.
I think it's very important and even insightful when you say learn the culture, because I think many times we as Americans, we group Native Americans as one, but it's different nations, different cultures, and in order to be culturally competent, we need to understand that when working with people. So I appreciate that. And I would,
Absolutely.
why? I feel like this has been answered, but I'll just ask just for clarification. Why do you believe that Native youth face harsher treatment in the justice system, and how can that be changed?
Well, there's a couple reasons. One is honestly, Native youth have inherited the legacy of colonialism. We have a history across our nations of being forcibly removed from our land, the land being stolen from us, forcibly disconnected from our medicines. Our language was stolen. We were, forced through to the boarding schools. The Indian Adoption Project in the 60s and 70s, which is the part of the reason for the Indian Child Welfare Act. That was where they scooped up our babies and adopted them out to families, white families, never to be heard of again. And so when, in the aftermath of all of these things, there has been a disconnect and a fragmentation in a way with our culture and with each other. And so what you see in our communities is this ongoing harm caused by those policies, the poverty, substance abuse, mental health. And that's not to say, it's terrible in all of these places and everyone's awful, but that's kind of the context for how we exist, is that we're struggling to heal from that. So we have the legacy of colonialism, and related to that is the racial bias and stereotyping, right? Oh, there's that Indian kid that's coming in here, right? He's trouble. He was here last time and he was stealing from us or whatever. It doesn't help when we have stereotypes in media that sort of reinforce this thinking about us as savages or cartoon characters that aren't actually real people. And then we have the issue of over-policing and jurisdictional conflict. And what that looks like is two things. With jurisdiction, as I explained, sometimes it's confusing to folks. This kid got into trouble, so who's going to prosecute him? I don't have the authority. You have the authority. And so what happens is people just sort of go, I don't really know how we're supposed to do this, so we're going to throw the book at this kid, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing that happens is these behaviors that are really expressions of trauma, they're criminalized and they're over-policed and they're pathologized, right? That kid has mental health issues, as opposed to, wow, what happened and how do we fix this? And then honestly, these systems, child welfare and justice, unless it's a tribal system, unless it's within the Native nations, these systems don't have anything that's culturally relevant or culturally appropriate for our families or our young people. So it just further enhances that separation from culture.
Yeah, I agree, because I talked a lot about the Black community and the intergenerational trauma that's passed down through generations, like things you learn subconsciously from like your ancestors. So I agree, I understand, because I feel like it's a totally different concept when you were stolen from when you were displaced from a land, but to have something stolen from you and have to stay in that place and watch it change over time. And I'm sure just like Black people, that Native people didn't receive any help either. They weren't helped through this trauma. They didn't receive any mental help or how to deal with this. It was just slap a band-aid on it, here you go, and we're going to do what we want to do anyways, which is so unfair. And it's not spoken of because you speak about these acts and things that were done in the 60s, and the only thing I know from the 60s that I was even taught was civil rights movement, but we don't talk about what what the natives had going on during that time. So I'm learning so much and it's
Yeah, well, I want to acknowledge something important that you said is Black community and Native community, like we haven't experienced exactly the same things, but that displacement and that disconnection and the intent for it to be that way, the intent to dehumanize the intent to the way that our bodies are commodities, and all of those things, they look different for each of the people that we come from. But it's also, that's why we're the two most disproportionately represented in justice.
And it's such an injustice. It's such an injustice. And I'm just learning, and I'm surprised that I haven't learned more about Native problems and I don't hear more about them, because like even in the history books you hear the basics, like we came, they took it over, it was they spread diseases, people died, and then we're moving on to the next subject. Like, it's crazy how much I don't know. um
It's not your fault. I want to reassure you, it's not your fault, and I appreciate your curiosity and your openness to learning and to exploring the things that you're hearing today. So thank you for
Thank you.
that.
And Miss Miller, I also love how you again are intertwining conversations that are really difficult to have, because you have referenced colonialism and coming in all of and colonizing and things that we know in today's in our world today, they're hot button topics. They're I think it's very appropriate, and I love the way that you carefully intertwine and the challenges, and also so we'll have an accurate understanding of how things unfolded. And I'll have to tell you, I at my graduate school we have the Catherine Booter Center, which focuses on outreaching to American Indian students. The language is a little different, and identifying those students for grad school. So I had to be really honest. Even when I attended there, I did not get the wealth of probably instruction and understanding that I should have gotten about the indigenous population. Um, it was a lot of focus on what can we do now, because there were so many wrongs, let's try to right them, but not a lot of solid history. And so again, much like our interviewer, this is great information and it's very necessary, because there is this historic thing of, okay, wrong was done, but let's move on. And having a good understanding of the context so we can really appreciate the changes and what we need to continue to do is really, really important for this conversation. And again, I also love your passion and enthusiasm, because it helps attach a level of interest to this particular topic that maybe some other people may have just skipped over.
Mhm. I really appreciate what you said, because I'll tell you, um, I grew up in Montana. I grew up in Billings, Montana, and our closest Native nations are the Crow Nation and the Northern Cheyenne Nation. And Crow, I mean, we're right down here. They have a whole national monument down there for Custer's last stand. And I always think about the fact in school, I mean, the guy lost. A Native woman took him out, right? Like, the guy lost. It's called the Custer's last stand, right? But I think it's really hilarious that when I was a kid coming up through elementary, middle school, and high school, despite that fact, he was a hero. And it wasn't until I was in college as a returning student later in life, I had to take specific classes to learn what I have learned. And again, I'm going to say, I think that's by design. And the other thing I want to say to your comments is that we have a saying across Native country. We hear it a lot from our elders. And that saying is, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you came from. Right.
Absolutely.
And so while I appreciate folks looking at, well, how do we move forward? How do we heal? I think that, yes, let's talk about that. But you have to know how we got here. And you have to, and that will help you to understand that you can't just put a bandage. This is entrenched across generations. And so there's not a quick fix. And some of the fixes, some of the healing will require systemic change.
Absolutely. Key. That is very key. Systemic change. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And systemic change is such a big barrier to overcome, because when it's so deeply embedded in the system, it's like, what is the system? Is it the system that needs to be changed, or just portions of it when it's really the entire system? But that's another wormhole to go down.
That's true. You need a whole other show for that one.
We'll have to bring you back for that discussion. We'll have to bring you back.
I would love to come back and talk with you.
I actually had the opportunity to read your article, Healing Native Youth Through Youth Justice Reform. So I have a few questions regarding that article.
Okay.
What are some of the biggest challenges I thought we answered this, but what are some of the biggest challenges Native youth faced in the current justice system?
Well, overrepresentation. But I think I can tell you they're also subjected to harsher and longer penalties. There's no cultural connection with any kind, assuming they are in a non-native jurisdiction. There's probably not much connection to any kind of culturally responsive programs. Depending on the system, and again, this goes by, it could vary by state. It also varies if that young person's in a state lockup versus a federal lockup. They may not be getting their education. They may not be have adequate access or any access to services that they need. So they're just kind of sitting there.
And why is it important to shift from punitive measures to healing-centered approaches for Native youth?
Because the punitive stuff doesn't work. There's Annie E. Casey Foundation and others. I think the Sentencing Project, the prison policy, a bunch of people have looked at it, and you know what's true is that throwing somebody in jail, incarceration, time and time again, doesn't keep them out of jail over the long term. I kind of think about it as again, if you go back and you think about what the root cause is of certain behaviors, it's kind of like saying, you've had a heart attack, so I'm going to order a haircut for you to go get better. Right? It's like, that doesn't make any sense. So if we really want to help our youth and keep them from this cycle, if we really want to break this cycle, and often it's a generational cycle, we have to understand that you need to address the underlying harm. The other thing about why it doesn't work, this punitive part of it, is because it doesn't treat somebody as a whole person. Like just think about the language. Oh, he's a criminal, or oh, she's a criminal. And that is their entirety as a human, and that is dehumanizing. So when we focus on healing centered approaches, that treats all of a person. And I just want to shout out to somebody that I used to work with. This woman was the head of a social services program in the nation. And we were talking about, what does it mean to be trauma informed? Right. And the saying that you often hear is, it's like, well, you ask not what's wrong with you, you ask what happened to you, right? That's being trauma informed. Well, I love hers so much better, because she says, for our babies, for our young people, we don't ask what happened to you. You know, it's not what is wrong with you. We need to ask what is strong with you. And we need to lean into that. And I want to say something, because especially if there's any Native youth listening to Auntie Kim over here, I think it's really important that when we have these kinds of conversations, we need to understand the trauma. We need to understand the history, but we also need to flip the script on that, and let's be informed by the history, but we need to follow the thread of resilience. Our young people, given the right support, they are our biggest champions. there are leaders, there are doctors, there are lawyers, and we need to support them in that way. And what I have found in my work as a lawyer, in social work, even in this justice work, we're constantly talking about trauma, intergenerational trauma. We've been subject to all this trauma. And the thing is the effect of that is that unfortunately it feels like that becomes who we are.
Absolutely.
And we're not our trauma. We're so much more than that. And I have had young people say to me, I'm not my trauma, and I don't want to be associated. This is who I am. Yeah, I'm a skateboarder. I like to do art. I'm nice to my grandma. You know? And so I just want to say that I think these conversations are really important, and we have to remember to balance them
Yes.
with the remembrance and the acknowledgement that our young people need our help and they need our support. And when we can all come together on their behalf in a good way, they're going to shine so bright. They're going to shine so bright, and they themselves are going to be bringing healing to all of us. So shout out to Native youth, shout out to our young relatives out there.
I definitely agree, especially when you say that the punitive measures do not work, and not just for Native youth, but across all peoples, because the prison system it isn't working. It's breeding criminals, sometimes to even be bigger criminals. So something's not working here, and they're not doing the work to even allow it to work for any individual. So there's definitely
That's
change
correct.
that needs to be made within the prison system for all people. And we have a
Yeah.
couple questions from the audience. What immediate corrective actions would you recommend to make real impact? Which was one of my questions as well coming up. So that's good.
So, wow, that's
I,
kind of a
was gonna
loaded
say that's a
question
big
because I'm
question.
just like,
There's a lot there. There's a lot there.
I don't know which immediate thing I want to pick. I think one thing I would say is, well, the obvious one, I'll say it. Stop locking our kids up. But so that's one.
We asked for the truth.
But
We
I would
asked you.
say
We asked for the truth.
you did that. So there it is. So stop locking our kids up. But I would also say I think what comes to mind, a practical answer, is every jurisdiction that has a young person come into their authority, they need to be asking that young person whether or not they have Native American heritage. And if they do, they need to be connecting with that young person's Native nation. If there's a possibility so that young person can be transferred to the jurisdiction of their nation, then that should happen. But at the very minimum, there needs to be meaningful collaboration, and everybody come together and come around that young person. So I think that would be my answer is this immediate, in the immediate.
And
Thank you.
our next question is, are Native American youth still learning their native language?
I'll give you such a lawyer answer. It depends. There are a lot of nations, even in urban centers where they have community centers or whatever. There are so many language revitalization projects going on across Native country. And so it depends on their nation and what their nation has. There's some young people that, you know, depending on where they grew up. I mean, I would even argue that for some youth, English is their second language and their native language is the first. It's probably rare because we have lost so many of our native language speakers. But yeah, there's lots of opportunities for them to be learning their original language.
All right, I believe that's all the questions from the audience. Oh no, you have a request to please repeat the community of practice request for volunteers.
Oh, we are recruiting members of our community of practice. And so if you know someone who works for a Native nation in a program or providing services, and those services support young people who are justice involved, you might be interested in joining our community of practice. And you can contact me for more information at kim@indian-affairs.org. And you can also, if you go to our website, you can connect with me there.
And just to help us just closing out, what can we do as social justice advocates and individuals do to advocate for Native youth justice reform?
Be curious, learn history, learn about how Native youth are impacted by the systems. If you live in an area where you have a Native nation close by, talk with them. Just talk with them. If you're in an urban center and there's a community center there that serves youth, volunteer, get to know them. And there's always the typical stuff, which is show up. Right? Show up and demand these organizations that are doing some really good work, support them. You can support us. If you visit our website, you can become a member, which is $25. I think it's $500 for lifetime membership. I'm sorry, I can't remember. But you can become a member of the association to support Native justice work. You can follow us on all of our socials. Just go on the internet and you can Google us, and we have all of the platforms so you can continue to learn and connect in opportunities. There's call for action in local communities, stand for young people. And I think this conversation is really important to have, because it's difficult for us to engage with one another in this way, to share information and ideas. So keep the dialogue open.
And lastly, is there any projects, books, or anything that you're working on that you would like to share with our viewers?
Project is, again, we're recruiting for the community of practice. There's always something going on at the association. So where I'm working on the adoptions campaign to educate folks about safe adoptions. We also, what I want to mention too is for Native students, we have scholarships that we offer Native students. And I believe we have opened the application process now. So any Native students that are listening can go to our website, and there's more information on the website for that. And then coming up this summer, we're going to have grants that we offer to Native summer youth camps.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Metler. I'm sure everyone is so full of knowledge, as I am. And we appreciate you for coming on today and speaking with our viewers. And thank you. Thank you for sharing your lived experience, your work, your project, and keep on doing the work. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was such a fun morning. Thank you.
Definitely appreciate it. And we will be closing.
Thank you for listening to the Justice Beat. If you like what you heard and found the information useful, then support the Justice Beat radio show by spreading the word and telling a friend.